The concept of neurodiversity has evolved. From its inception discussing the integration of autistic individuals in mainstream settings to recognizing disability, difference, variance, and even being boldly called a competitive advantage. Over the years, the movement has awakened a new understanding of possibility, neurocognitive functioning, and how we think about people, potential, and capabilities. In this episode, I sit down with J. David Hall of NeuroGuides. Together, we discuss the many faces of the neurodivergent movement, its future direction, and where we believe it ultimately needs to take us. Hi, I'm Dr. Theresa Haskins, and welcome to Think Differently, the podcast that challenges the status quo and explores the power of neurodiversity to create a more inclusive and accessible world. Together, we will talk about everything from the value of different perspectives to the limitless potential of human beings. We'll explore how embracing differences can lead to endless possibilities and how you can maximize strengths to make a positive impact on the world. So sit back, relax, and join me as we get ready to think differently. Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Think Differently. Today, I'm very excited that we are joined by J. David Hall to discuss the current state of the neurodiversity movement and the future we're desiring to create. David is the founder and CEO of the Foundation for Life Guides for Autistics and NeuroGuides. His team at NeuroGuides helps neurodivergent individuals succeed socially, occupationally, and relationally. What's also important to know is David was diagnosed as autistic in 2018, and he's a dedicated advocate and father to 3 autistic children. So we have that in common as parents of children with autism. So welcome, David. I'm so glad you could be here with us today.
Wonderful to be here. I'm just delighted. As you mentioned earlier, we've sort of followed each other a bit, and so it's good to meet face to face and just get to have a great conversation about the state of the neurodiversity movement.
Yes, and we are definitely going to tackle that. But before we jump into our conversation about the state of the neurodiversity movement, I would like you to tell the audience, because some may or may not be familiar with your work, about NeuroGuides and why you're so passionate specifically about autism and neurodiversity.
That's a great place to start. So my journey with this particular organization, the mission, the vision started it's actually about 10 years ago. We've been a 501c3 nonprofit for 8 years. But I started this organization in response to what I discovered after doing quite a bit of research on outcomes for autistic and other neurodivergent people. What I was discovering is that life outcomes, particularly people over the age of 21, were, it would be understating it to say they were horrible, really. Incredible amounts of social struggle, anxiety, chronic depression, and really the one that just sort of rattles me every day and keeps me going is that it's been estimated that there is a 9 times the national average suicide rate for neurodivergent people, adults. And so, I was looking at these outcomes and I'm thinking we have to do better, right? Because I thought we had all these, tools and things for helping. And I was seeing this myself as I parented 3 diagnosed autistic kids, that what tools there were, many of them were very problematic, and they made a lot of assumptions about autistic people and about autistic minds. And so I began looking around for something better, right? And I'm thinking, how can I support other people, right? How can I help them to do these things? And I was really surprised that there was nobody. There was nothing, 0, 10 years ago. Now, that has changed. So there's a lot of groups and individuals, a lot more resources available now in terms of doing things that I believe to be appropriate and effectual in helping better the outcomes of autistic people. So that's why I got into this. That's why I started this. And it's only fair to explain my view of autism as well. It's just over 80 years now that we've had that word, right? We've had the word autism, which literally, if you break it down, aut or one, selfistic. So I can always imagine, and I do often, that Hans Asperger and his colleagues in their lab coats with their clipboards, as they sat down in front of this group of very uniquely minded youth, they were thinking, well, they're set apart. They're in their own world. They're autistic, right? So that was the name they probably scribbled on their clipboard, and it stuck with us. Although autistic people, neurodivergent people, have been around long, long before Hans Asperger was here. In fact, I like to joke with people that we were very busy creating civilization and technology and the culture. So we've been around forever. And so there's this what we call the medical deficit model, and that's where the problem is. The medical deficit model, I'm going to lay it right at the feet of Hans Asperger and Connor and all the rest of them. Right, because they wanted to do all the medical and psychiatric things that they were trying to do. Right, they wanted to diagnose, they wanted to create a workable therapeutic strategy. They wanted to medicate us and fix us, and because they assumed that we're broken. Right, we're not normal. We're neurodivergent. We're not neurotypical, and so that sprung up what is now estimated to be a multi-billion-dollar industry. It's called the autism industry, and it is dedicated to correcting behaviors, correcting our ways of thinking, our social deficits. Whatever it starts with, you're broken, right? You're broken, and you're going to be fixed. And again, it's a huge moneymaker. And I have stood diametrically opposed to that industry for a decade now, as an ambassador for the neurodiversity movement, and as someone who is a guide, a practitioner, someone who works with neurodivergent people every day.
Yeah. I think what's interesting is you came around the same time I did, where there were no resources. We weren't using the word neurodiversity, right? It was autism inclusion, ADHD support. The DISC conditions weren't really getting any press, right? So there was all these things happening. And much like you, started to formulate strategies because there were just these gaps. And the things that existed didn't resonate, didn't work. You fast forward 10 years, now it's called neurodiversity. The conditions that fit in that bucket have expanded considerably. But then I think about how it's transforming, because now I'm going to go back 20 years ago, probably when your children and mine were diagnosed, going all the way to person first language. Like I always like to tell the new generation, that started based on the need, because we needed the typical majority to see people with autism as people, not a disability. And
yes.
I think it's a privilege to fast forward 20 years and that you can be autistic and proud and have that identity first language. And I think that being in a society where we can actually have that debate means we have made way more progress than we think. So that's I think that's something to celebrate. But then you look at the medical model, and there are components and different aspects of autism based on the individual. We'll just go to autism because that's our first starting point, where there is some need for support, depending on what that needs to be. And then there's the societal construct of some of the things we do as a society are becoming the disabling barrier. And so I think this is where that neurodiversity movement comes in, where I think it's like anything. I like to use the analogy that if I'm blind, I have a disability, but you can create buildings and structures that, regardless of my disability, I can navigate, or you can make having this disability even more disabling because there's tripping hazards and, right? So I think that's why I want to bring people along on the journey, that we're not saying that it couldn't be disabling as a disability, but how we create our society, how we create access to education and employment is often more disabling than the neurological differences are themselves.
Absolutely. Agreed.
That's how I think about it. So one of the things we were going to talk about, and so we're going to go there, is there are like great things about the neurodiversity movement. And then there's some things, and I know you've been writing about it, so we're going to talk about it here shortly. It's like, is this where we want to go? Before we go into the opportunities of the neurodiversity movement, what do you think's working? Like, what are the benefits you've seen so far with creating this larger umbrella that brings more neurodivergent or neurospicy? I'm trying to think of all of them, or neurovariant groups together.
Neurospicy, great word. So, yeah, well, I'm not quiet, am I, about it? So, and that's the thing. If you're going to stand in the gap, if you're going to be an ambassador for something, then you're called not to be quiet. I don't mind working behind the curtains. I've done that for years, and actually, there's a lot of me that prefers that, right? But that's a great place to start. What are the positives? What has gone right? And I've had my own shoulder at the proverbial wheel, turning it for 10 years now. And even though it feels very distant to get to what I call the day of neurodiversity on that day. And let me tell you just real quickly what that day looks like so that you'll have some perspective, right? Where do I see us going? And by the way, the bad news is, Theresa, I don't think I'm going to see it. I don't think I will live long enough to see this day, but that's okay.
Right.
We work towards it. The day looks like this. There is no more. There may not even be a word autistic anymore. That may be just sort of like fallen in the history books and fallen away. There will be a culture-wide, workplace culture-wide, social and relationship-wide, in all parameters of human interaction and engagement, acceptance that, you know what, your mind, even though it's unique, is absolutely accepted. It is full cognitive inclusion. Just made that up. I hope it works. So it's this idea that even if you think uniquely, you're still valued, and you're given full acceptance, inclusion. It's a part of everyday walk now. That's the day that I want to see. That's the day that I want to get there. Have we taken steps in that direction? Absolutely. I work with companies, corporations. I've trained and done workshops for some very large companies, at least 10 Fortune 500 companies. And there, if I run the proverbial clock back 10 years to now, I will tell you that there are a lot more open doors and people that will readily understand what you're doing now. That was not the case 10 years ago. So there has been sort of if there's a stepping stone, we've gotten to step number 2 or 3. We've moved up in that place now that people are starting to understand what this is about and why we're doing this and why there is such a thing called neurodiversity movement. That's the most positive. It's the narrative. We're beginning to change the narrative. I'll give you a quick example. About 10 years ago, having these conversations about autism and autistic people, there was almost nowhere and no one that I would engage with 10 years ago that wouldn't, first of all, sort of stand back, mouth open, and look at me, but they would say something to the effect of, "Oh, yeah, I saw that on TV. There was that guy, or that movie with Dustin Hoffman." There was this sort of quick, down and dirty connection with neurodivergent autistic minds as something that was, the idiot savant, or someone that, intellectually disabled, IDD, or cognitively disabled. There was something that just stood out, and that was the one-to-one correspondence. And it's not there anymore. I run into it much less than I used to. I consider that to be a good step forward, don't you?
I do too. And right, we don't hear the Rain Man reference as much as we did in the past. I also think, though, it's generationally different. The generation that had seen that movie is actually getting older, and some of the newer generation, they don't even know what that movie is. So,
well, it's time to restate, right?
Right.
It is really time to restate, and we need to tell people. And I say this every time I get the opportunity, in writing and speaking and so on. I always say, please understand that. There are a minority of autistic persons who are cognitively or intellectually disabled, IDD. That's real, it's very real, but it's a minority. The vast majority, diagnosed and undiagnosed, of autistic people are not IDD or cognitively disabled. I want to make that distinction for several reasons. First of all, is because the people with IDD, they need now and will need a lot of support as they go through their life and their journey. Right. And I want to challenge people to think, when they think of neurodivergent autistic people, to not just go into a minority bracket and say that's everybody, because it's absolutely not. Right. And we're not all geniuses. How about that?
Right,
there
that's
are
the gifted.
very gifted. Right. But not everybody. And that's fine. Everybody's mind is unique. We have our gifts, we have our challenges.
Right. And I like to call out that, like in the news, sometimes you'll hear about autistics that maybe, there's like an aggressive tendency, but that's PDA. Like, again, there's these concurrent conditions
that's right,
create new problems. And in the old DSM-4, they capture them a little bit better by having the separation, meaning, if you had Rett's or disintegrative generative disorder, that kind of captured those with IDD and other significant comorbidities, right? But now that they've changed it, they're really looking at autism from the social and cognitive framework, and they've separated some of these other things into like co-concurring conditions. So how we're clustering
that's
is actually very different.
It's better. And the final component of this, in the positive track that we're going towards, is something that we have to state every day, because without this one piece, without this one component, the entire neurodiversity movement paradigm just falls apart. And it's this: what we're trying to do is create this peculiar synergy towards acceptance for all minds. And, people may just state that and then move on, but I wanted to sink in. We're talking about everyone. I want full and complete validity and inclusion for everyone, for neurotypicals, for neurodivergence, of all shades and colors, everybody. Because if you start breaking it down and becoming sort of playing favorites in the neurodiversity movement, the thing collapses, because that's not the vision. That's not the design, right?
Right. And that's what I think people like. The whole concept of diversity is the inclusion of all the variances, including the majority. And somebody goes, oh, well, there's neurodiverse individuals. I go, no, individuals are not neurodiverse. I mean, it's okay that we say that, but you get diversity by the inclusion of differences. And then the other thing I find I have to explain to folks is, when we say that neurodivergent people think differently, it's not like a choice that they were brought up a certain way and therefore they have a certain mindset, but that they actually have a different neurocognitive wiring. So I think you've heard the PC thing, PC versus Mac, but that's really the best analogy. They are different operating systems.
Right. But they do their own particular jobs in their own particular unique ways, right?
And they can do the same jobs. They just don't necessarily do them the same. Right. So different software. And so, obviously the movements evolved over time, and you do have the mindset of like, so neurodiversity includes all of us, but there's this, I think there's a few things going on. We got things within the neurodivergent community that I think we're still working through. And then we have the neurotypical community that, like you said, more people are getting it. I would lean people that were already diversity minded and kind of in that space. Because one of the things I'm seeing is social media creates this curation, and there's this bubble where you think that people are more diversity minded than they are. And then
Right.
you go to like some conference, or like I went to a faculty workshop and they don't even know what neurodiversity is. That's why we're here. So I think the movement's made a lot of progress, but I still think it's in smaller circles. Are you seeing that?
Yes, and that we'll get to that in a minute. But that is one of my
Yep.
concerns, that there was sort of, what's the proverbial circle the wagons. We move into tighter and tighter groups, right? And we, I wrote down earlier, I forgot to say it, but it's conversations and intersections. These are positive things of the movement. We must step boldly into spaces where these kind of conversations are being allowed to sort of dissolve. They're not happening the way they should be. I will, at risk of some booze and people throwing things at me, that's fine. I will tell you, I'm going to confess that last month I journeyed to New York City, where I attended the American Psychiatric Association meeting. So I'm sure a lot of people would say, "What on earth were you doing there?" Because that's sort of the enemy camp. But I don't believe that that's the way we should think of it. I really believe that we must push the narrative. We must push the dialogue. We must push the conversations. Look, when I was there, I walked past, plenty of, behaviorists. I walked past the books of how to fix autistic people, and I saw it all. But I also had the opportunity to intersect with people who were curious about the work I was doing, right? And to have that kind of dialogue and to have that build that kind of energy. That's what we need more of.
Right. And I think, so people don't boo, but I do think that we have to work with the American Psychological and Psychiatric Associations, because they are the key to diagnosis today, for good or bad, right? If you want to get the official diagnosis and follow up within the ADA rules for those of us in the US to get the accommodations for employers that require it. There is a space for it, because while the neurodiversity movement implies universal constructs that make everything accessible for all, David, like you said, we don't live there yet. So,
Not yet.
That's the future state we're working towards. Today, you're probably going to need a diagnosis to get some of the accommodations you want, because some employers are still at the stage of their life where they only do things when they have to. And so we just have to kind of live within that reality.
I've seen lots of that. Right. Yeah, Theresa. Well, maybe in the DSM-12 will be the point where autism just drops out. It's not even there anymore. It's like, give us some new thing, uniquely minded, whatever.
Well, and I think that it might be comforting for some of the listeners to know that there are a lot of therapists and psychologists and even psychiatrists that are doing diagnoses today, that when they are giving these diagnoses, they're even going vague in their write-ups, because if you're in that space, regardless of what the battery says, they are kind of within the space. And those that are more neurodiversity minded, and there's plenty of them out there, they get it. And so they're trying to balance this is what's required from a medical diagnostic perspective, and also understanding the batteries and things we're using, they know are not perfect. So
you're right.
They know.
You're right.
They're trying.
And the wave is small right now. Here's my word picture. The wave is small, but it is still sea change. And if you talk to therapists, psychiatrists, psychologists who are, I'm just going to say it, who are, maybe under 30, but this sort of newer generation. I had one tell me about 2 years ago. She said to me, "David, what you are saying is what we're being taught now." She said, and it is very different. She said, but please keep saying this, right? Don't stop saying what you're saying, because it's a part of the change and we're seeing it. So that gave me a lot of confidence and assurance right there, right? That this new paradigm is being created, and it's challenging the old narrative, the old brokenness narrative, the narrative of, you need to be fixed.
And so you do talk about things you don't like about the movement. And there's many of them. I have some opinions as well. Let's start. So we've made a lot of progress. It's 2024. What is one of the biggest trends you're seeing that you're like, this might derail us?
I think one of the dangers, and this is not exclusive to the neurodiversity movement. This is a part of every movement. It's a part of every every sort of pathway through our culture. This is not to be unexpected, but and I will say that there's probably some validity to sort of that this is a byproduct of living in a very consumer capitalistic kind of society. Is that everybody wants to make money off a thing, right? And they want to make money. There are people who want to make money, and there are people who are making a lot of money off neurodivergent people, off this neurodiversity model. So it started I'm going to say about 2 years ago. I started to seeing a lot of groups, organizations, companies sort of trotting out the neurodiversity slogans and, charging for them, making money off doing things. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't make money. That's not what I'm saying. But if you take the neurodiversity movement and commodify it, right, and turn it into a product, you immediately risk losing the potency of this very unique movement, which I think is the ultimate human rights movement, because you cheapen it. And I believe that there are quite a few people and groups that they seem to be quite happy with cheapening it. They really don't want to talk about the bigger picture. They want to add it to their corporate portfolio to sell it to large companies who are hearing, right? They're getting the ears tickled about this neurodiversity thing they've heard about. Well, these people, obviously, they're very polished, and they, will only have to pay X number of dollars to learn all about it. I think that's a real problem. So I would say the creating a product out of the neurodiversity movement and our concepts, that's a big problem. The second thing, and I've got some solutions, but the second thing is that, and I say this very carefully. I walk very carefully on this one. Okay, great trepidation, because I know, and Theresa, I work with dozens of neurodivergent people one-on-one every week. I could tell you stories. Oh, the stories I could tell you, right? Of pain, disappointment, misunderstanding, miscommunication, and the list goes on and on, right? So we have this people group that has been treated quite badly over many, many years, right? Forever, right? And I get it that they want to step out from behind the curtains of being misunderstood and bullied and treated as less than, children of a lesser God. I get that. Okay. But we have to check ourselves as a community. I'm a part of the neurodivergent community, and I want the community to hear me on this. We've got to check ourselves in not creating this special club where we speak loudly. We're speaking to ourselves, right? We're being boxed off. I don't want that to happen, because that is the opposite direction of the path to the day of neurodiversity.
No, absolutely. I think one of the things, and we talked about this at the beginning, is people have more of a voice and they feel more confident in it. And whether it's neurodiversity or other diversity movements, what people have to realize is, even though you have a voice, you're still a minority group. And the majority group is still the gatekeepers. We have to work in partnership. So it can be hard when you feel that you've been disenfranchised, and maybe it's not a feeling, you have been. excluded.
Yes.
And then you have people trying to do the right thing. And this is kind of like when they were talking about unconscious bias and it went to the nth degree. Yes, there are people that may have done things that were wrong or harmful. But at some point, you could raise awareness in that. But if you penalize everybody you talk to and villainize the people you need to be allies, they just shut down. So I think that I have seen that like when people are like, ooh, we want to learn about this, and you'll have a business. I've seen the conversations where they're like, I want to learn more about neurodiversity and autism for the competitive advantage. That's a trigger word, by the way, friends. Yes. But that's a well-intentioned person because they're business-minded and they don't know what they don't know. And we kind of like go at the jugular, and then that person just shuts down, where we could be like, hey, I'd like to educate you on, it's not a competitive advantage, but it's a human rights issue. Let's connect. Like nicely bring them into the fold.
Which we need that.
Right.
The old proverbial walk softly, carry a big stick. We need to think more assertively in how we speak into the narrative. I'll give you an example, and this is really important as to the structure and the movement, the momentum of this thing we call the neurodiversity movement. I said a moment ago, and if it didn't sink into to the listeners, I want to say it again. The neurodiversity movement, to me and to some others, is the greatest human rights movement ever. Did you just say that? Yes, I did. So what I mean by that is all these other incredible movements that have occurred over the hundreds of years, right? They're all significant. They're all powerful. They all have validity and all that. But this movement says that no matter the uniqueness of your mind, its challenges, its co-occurrences, it's whatever, the uniqueness of each and every human mind is so important to be understood and given full validity that it encompasses all other differences, socioeconomics, religious, it envelops them all. Because at the end of the road, if you are fully accepted for being a unique human person, then I fully accept everything else about you. I have about 70% of our autistic clients that we work with are LGBTQ.
Right.
And while there's a certain part of me that says, well, that's fascinating, I really don't dwell on that, right? At all. Because all I can see, Theresa, I want you to hear me. All I can see are these beautiful, unique human minds. Everything else about them, bring it on.
Bring it on. And it's an interesting thing that you said that is in your opinion and others, it's the most important human rights advocate. I've been saying for a long time, although maybe it's good that we didn't win a seat at the DEI table since there's an attack on it now. But I used to tell folks that if you would, and it was autism inclusion at the time, because I've started a while ago.
I remember.
And now it's neurodiversity. But here's the dealio, friends. I stand by this, that if you were an autistic inclusive organization, if you had figured out how to do that very well, then you are more likely to be ADHD and disinclusive. And if you actually have achieved the psychological safety and the type of teamwork and collaboration that would be required and the respect of individual differences, by default, I believe you've actually created more diversity-minded human beings, period.
I agree.
And so we are 100% alignment. I feel this is the gate. If you actually solve for this problem, you actually solve for the majority of the things that we've been working at bespoke for years.
Then you will be on the doorstep.
Yep.
of that day of neurodiversity.
Because the truth is, and what people don't understand is like disability inclusion, you could have attack it from a mobility and physical constructs, and then it was technological access. When you think about gender diversity, it could be a metrics of how many men to women you have. But neurodiversity requires us to be better in terms of how we work, how we communicate. You have to address toxicity. It seeps into everything. And if you actually have a team that successfully can include neurodivergent individuals, they are a better team with a better leader. All the things that leadership books are trying to solve for. When I did my research on what neurodivergent managers needed, because we had some pockets of people that were showing some success, my findings actually emulated findings on a psychological safety study. The only difference is neurodivergent people need direct communication, which neurotypical people do not do well with. And that would be about it, right?
Well, don't get me started on the social script. That's a whole nother matter.
We're losing the constructive feedback in your flowery bookends. If everything's great, then why am I fixing it? So note to self, guys.
Yeah. Point taken.
Yeah. And so do you feel the movement's inclusive of all the neurodivergent voices? Because I do feel like some pockets are louder. And I remember when we were starting to talk about neurodiversity, it really was more of an autism versus neurotypical framework, and then very quickly expanded to include what I call the big six. But now we know that, it's countless in terms of neurovariance and cognitive functioning. So, but do you think that there's still a set that is the primary voice? And do you think it's shifting? Because I feel like autism was the primary voice and I see a shift, but I wanted to know if you see a shift.
Again, Theresa, I'm going to be very careful with stepping here, okay, walking in this path. Because, and I've studied and I've given careful consideration and a lot of thoughtfulness to the concept of being trauma informed. And this community, this movement, if it is not trauma informed, it is in trouble from the very start, right? Because we have vast numbers of people who have struggled and experienced terrible things. So we have to start with being gentle with one another. I have an issue with, and I'm going to confess that I've sort of just sidestepped a lot of these conversations because I'm trying to get to this place on the horizon and I don't want to get tangled up in anything that's going to stop me here. I want to keep as many people moving towards that horizon as I can. I'm giving you a lot of word pictures today, by the way. Okay. So I think that there are certain elements, and again, I would never name names or anything like that, but there are certain elements, small cliques in the neurodiversity movement, in the autistic neurodivergent community, who seem to relish drawing attention to themselves. I guess, you could easily just write it off as sort of a vanity. But I think we need to be careful even with that. I think that there are so many people who have been repressed and constrained and marginalized and treated badly that they're finding that they're able now to speak and be accepted by others in the neurodivergent community. So I want to validate that part, right? But I want to say at the same time, if all you're doing is sort of celebrating yourself endlessly, then who are you helping, right? Who are you connecting with? Because one of the reasons that I do this, that I am on this journey, is because that 15-year-old in Iowa who is so desperately alone and does not see a future and a way forward, and they're in danger of taking their life. Those are the people that we ought to be thinking of, the marginalized still. So I want us to be careful about sort of waving our own personal flag and sort of out-competing the next voice to get on top of this supposed platform or stage I told someone, this is about 5 years ago. I had someone say to me, David, we're doing this award ceremony for I forget the title of it. It was like neurodiversity, autism, something like that. It's an award show, and I want to nominate you for this award. And I said, but I thought about it, and it's like, I just said no. I said, do not ever try and give me a trophy. Do not ever try and give me an award, because I'll just walk away. All I care about is getting us there, right, to that day. And for all the marginalized still, that's where we need to be reaching. Let's pull them together. Let's help them. Let's give them encouragement.
As you're speaking, I think about one of the narratives that are out there about autism as a superpower, or neurodivergency can be a superpower. And I think for some people it might be. But then there's people on the other side. There are folks that I have worked with. They have graduate degrees. You've worked with folks like this too. They've been through the cycle of all the employment things. They're brilliant people, can't hold jobs. And so it doesn't feel like a superpower for them at all.
Right.
And so
Absolutely.
we just want to be mindful that, like, if you found your niche and you have the right people around you and you're succeeding, that's great. But there's people that are probably just as bright and talented, and they're just hitting the brick walls. And
I work with them every day. I could tell you about some of the most beautiful, brilliant, amazing individuals who feel so isolated and so alone and so misunderstood. My methodology, my process in Life Guides for Autistics, NeuroGuides, is we call it E3, right? First, E is engage. We build unique bridges, looking for that perfectly aligned job, et cetera, bringing people out to understand who their intrinsic selves are, right? That's engagement. Second is equipping. And, I tell people, look, we don't do formulas. We don't treat people like we don't do this sort of, you treat you like a mold, A to Z, we're going to stamp you and you're going to know all the, no, we help you as you need help. But the big one, the big E, the one at the end, encouragement, putting courage into, right?
Mm-hmm.
That is so desperately needed today. With so many of the people you just mentioned, and I've mentioned, that we need to encourage one another. Instead of celebrating our laurels, let's lift up others. Let's do that. Let's do that first. Maybe at that day we can all stand on the stage and we can all wave our flags and all that. But let's get there first.
Well,
together.
Like I said, I think it's such a win that identity first language exists, because 30 years ago, that wouldn't have even been possible. Our time together is flying. I think you and I could talk all day.
So we could.
There's so much more to go. And obviously, you are an excellent resource with your NeuroGuides and you give individuals coaching, but some of the people listening are just allies and community members. What are some things they could be doing, or family members could be doing, that could really make sure that they're helping their neurodivergent colleagues or family members?
I would say to try and challenge yourself, test yourself, to have a mindset, and do this quietly, but treat yourself this way. Have a mindset of actual inclusivity for all persons and all minds. That may sound a bit confusing, but what I mean by that is the neurodiversity movement includes all, right? It's neurotypicals, it's neurodivergence, it's all the uniquely minded, no matter who they are. And if we walk in the wrong direction, I had this conversation with my dad one time. I said, look, I said, we're headed this direction, right? We know that we want to be over there. But if I go 1 foot off to the left as we travel, I said, it may look like we're walking side to side now, but I said, in a month, I won't even be able to see you anymore, right? So we have to talk to each other and include each other in all conversations. So the language we use, the descriptives we use, the narrative we use, we need to pay attention to that. So if you're an ally, if you're an advocate, be an ally and advocate, not just for neurodivergent people, but be an ally and advocate for all persons, because that is the pathway of the neurodiversity movement. That's it, right? I would say too, be kind to yourself. We have so many people who are burdened with sensory processing disorder. And we may lose that name eventually in time, but let's just say that we have so many people who are overwhelmed with sensory inputs. I myself struggle with auditory and visual. I get a lot of jokes from the people who love me about, David, you're secretly a vampire or something. I get it, all right, but it's real and it's painful and it's disruptive for many people. So I want people to pay attention to those things. Let's see other people in light of their challenges, accepting, but also validating them in those challenges. And I would just say that if you're an advocate and an ally, and like me, an ambassador of the neurodiversity movement, just understand we're in this for the long journey. We're in this for the long walk. But every day you can do something that moves us all together in the right direction.
And it is a long game.
Yes, it is.
How can people reach out to you if they want to learn more about NeuroGuides or if they need counseling support themselves?
Sure. It's very simple. I've got a lot of people who work with us. We've got a board of directors who are, the majority of them are neurodivergent, autistic themselves. That was by design. We've got a great executive team member, Dr. Marcy Champy, better beloved by the community as now Dr. Samantha Kraft. We have just wonderful volunteers and people around us. And so they're incredibly helpful to me. But if you'd like to just, at no cost, just have someone to talk to understand what you're going through, just reach out. You can go right to neuroguides.org, and click on the connect and set up a time to talk. We're here. This is what we do all the time.
We are here, and you're definitely not alone. David, I think we have another conversation to go about more things, digging deep.
All right.
I thank you for your candor today and talking about the neurodiversity movement, because it's an area of passion for me. And it's an interesting thing to see how it's organically moved. But for those of you out there, neurodiversity does include you. You are a part of realizing this, and it's going to take all of us to make it happen. So thank you, David, for joining me. And thank you all for listening today.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a great one. Thank you for listening to this episode of Think Differently. I hope you found our discussion today insightful and thought-provoking. I want to thank Audio Works Studios for their exceptional production and recording support. Without their expertise and dedication, this podcast would not be possible. If you enjoyed this episode, we encourage you to share it with others. Your support helps us to reach new audiences and promote neurodiversity in our world. Also, be sure to subscribe to this podcast on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite platform so that you can stay up to date on the latest episodes. We look forward to seeing you again soon on Think Differently.